Welcome to the NAHA webinar brought to you by the National Association for Holistic Aromatherapy. To learn more about NAHA, please visit www.naha.org. Tonight's presentation topic is A Healing Garden in Your Backyard. This educational webinar is being presented by Sharon Falsetto. Sharon is a UK certified clinical aromatherapist, and she is the founder of Sedona Aromatherapy, Home Study Linguistics of Aromatics program. She's also the author of Authentic Aromatherapy. Sharon is the chief editor of the NAHA Aromatherapy Journal and the NAHA Regional Director for Arizona. She tends to her own aromatherapy garden in Sedona, Arizona on a 1-acre homestead. To learn more about Sharon, please visit her website at www.sedonaaromatherapy.com, and that is aromatherapy with an IE at the end. Okay, so Sharon, I'd just like to take a moment and welcome you tonight. I'm presenting on what I think is going to be one of my most favorite topics, especially this time of the year. We're getting ready to start our garden too, so this is perfect timing, so thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, for NAHA asking me to talk about this topic. I'm going to be very excited to share some things with you about gardening and aromatically. So I'm going to bring up the first slide, which I'm going to briefly go through about what we're going to talk about in this webinar. I'd like to start with a quote by Hannah Rion, where she says, "The greatest gift of the garden is the restoration of the 5 senses." I personally believe that a healing garden includes all of the senses, not just aroma. That includes sight, taste, touch, and sound, and bringing all of these senses together to create a healing environment. Of course, aromatic plants are an integral part of a healing garden. Herbalists taught to understand and identify plants, but aromatherapists don't normally get that kind of training, and I personally believe it's something we should understand as aromatherapists, where our essential oils and hydrosols and other aromatic extracts come from. And we will be looking at how to introduce healing plants into your own backyard, whether you've got a window ledge, just a garden pot, or several garden beds. You can start simply on a window ledge, and we will be looking at that. Without beneficial pollinators, you probably wouldn't have any type of a garden. Pollinators work in conjunction with the plants in the garden to create the environment for plants to grow, and we'll be looking at bees, butterflies, bats, moths, and birds, specifically hummingbirds, which are prevalent here in the southwest of the US. I'm sorry if that doesn't apply to your area of the country, but I'm sure that you'll be interested in what these amazing little birds can do, and the plants that all of these pollinators prefer, identifying the color and the scent of each one. We could look at quite a lot of aromatic plants, but the ones I've chosen to look at in this webinar are the mints, specifically peppermint and spearmint. We'll also be looking at basil, oregano, barrage, sunflower, rosemary, German chamomile, and sage. And I'll go through a brief profile on each of those plants. And we'll finish up with some aromatic recipes from the garden, including an oil, a tea, and a fun recipe for ice cubes that you can put in summer drinks. And then we'll briefly just look at a slideshow of some of the plants in my aromatic garden to finish. So let's go ahead and get started with that. The first thing we are going to be looking at in the role of the 5 senses is vision, sight. I think this is a very important area in addition to aroma in the garden. Colour, for example, can add so much to a garden. You can have all sorts of bright colours, pastel colours, mix them up, put them in straight lines. If you're a type A personality, you probably want a more ordered formation. And it can also depend on what pollinators you want to attract into the garden. As I discussed just briefly there before, some pollinators prefer coloured plants, some prefer scent plants, some prefer a specific plant, and we'll look at that a little bit more detail later on. The style of the garden, personally I prefer the cottage style, but some people may prefer something more formal, Edwardian or Victorian styles, Japanese, or just a few potted plants on the patio. All of this can add to the visual aspect of your garden. Just looking briefly at Victorian gardens, they were more formalized and they became more condensed with massive colour rather than scented gardens. Previously in medieval gardens, which I'm going to look at a little later on, so I don't want to discuss it here in too much detail, they were more fragrant, whereas the Victorians were liked the colours better. So the scented flowers kind of faded out in the Victorian and the Edwardian era, which followed the Victorian era. It was an emphasis on bold colour over fragrance. However, a gardener by the name of William Robinson, who was around in the period 1838 to 1935, he's had much influence on the style of gardens today. And he was the one that kind of came up with what commonly came known as the English cottage garden, where you mixed perennial plants with annual plants in all sorts of a mishmash of colours. More what I would call a type B personality than a type A personality. You have to get past that uniform kind of vision in your garden. But it all depends on what you prefer at the end of the day. I'm just giving you some ideas here. Another visual aspect is the maintenance of your garden. You might be a person that doesn't mind doing a little bit of weeding. If you've got a cottage style garden, you probably won't notice the weeds as much as you would in a formal garden. So you've got to bear that in mind, how much weeding you may have to do. New plants, unfortunately, plants do die throughout the season for one reason or another, and you may have to pop in a new one. So think about your colour and your style, whether you want something that's going to match, or you may want to put something else in there to try it out. Also, deadheading. Some people don't believe in deadheading plants. They like to leave them for the birds for food over the winter. For example, echinacea plants can be left like this, and sunflower plants as well. If you've got all those, they're not technically called seed heads, but that's where they contain all the seeds inside the sunflower, which I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as well. You can leave them for food for the birds, or sometimes they reseed over the winter themselves. Sunflowers are actually an annual plant, but I've had sunflowers come back year after year, and I think they reseed in themselves. Finally, you might want to make your garden look more visually appealing by adding some accessories, depending on what kind of person you are. This could be maybe a little bit of artwork, some of those garden decor ornaments that you find at the garden centre, little knick-knacks. Some people don't like that, but it just depends what you want to look at, and take that into account and what you would find visually appealing and healing for yourself. So we'll go on to the next one, which is touch. Now, this is a photo of my dog. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I just had to stop for a minute there. And this is a photo of my dog, George. Now he's the kind of dog who fully takes in the healing garden aspect. He likes to sniff everything, he likes to eat everything, you know, he gets into things he shouldn't get into, but he's enjoying the aromas of the garden. The final point, just to jump ahead here, I've got pets and children. You've got to take that into account in the garden. That children are just as curious as pets, like dogs and even cats. So bear in mind what plants you're putting in the garden. Watch your pets or your children, don't put them in your mouth without knowing what it is. And if there's any other sort of sticky residue they might be able to get into. So just going back to the first point here I had, this texture. What do I mean by soft, hard, fuzzy? Plants have different textures, and in my opinion, just to give you an example, a rose, the flowers, not the thorns we're looking at here, has a soft kind of texture, a little bit like the aroma and the essential oil as well, if you can visualize that. And touching a rose is kind of soft to me versus hard. I'm thinking like tree bark. Some people like that solid foundation. If you're over touching a rose, again, it's a healing thing we're talking about, so it's a personal preference what it brings to you. Fuzzy, I kind of mean like hairy here, if you're thinking hairy plants. Sunflowers, once they get a big stalk on them, they have got a very fuzzy kind of feel to them. I'm not talking about little baby seedlings. I'm talking ones that can grow up to 6 foot high. I had one that was taller than me in my garden last year, and its stalk is fuzzy. You know, it's kind of an unusual kind of touch. Also, the barrage plants, which we're going to be looking at, it has kind of hairy, fuzzy leaves as well. The one thing I would caution with barrage is that I have heard people get contact dermatitis from this plant, so be careful about that. The other things we need to be aware of are thorns. I mentioned roses. Sticky. Sticky comes from some trees produce resins which are sticky. Also the pollen on the flowers. If you think about a bee jumping about from one flower to another, he kind of collects, sorry, I should say she, because most bee workers are she's, she'll collect kind of pollen on her back, and it's sticky to them as well. And so if you brush against the plants, you might get pollen on yourself there as well. So bear that in mind, depending on which plant it is. Poisonous, the first plant I think about is a foxglove. Even though herbally it's got some uses, it can be poisonous to animals and children and us in the garden. So just be aware of that. Same with toxins, I mentioned, contact dermatitis with Barrage. There are other plants as well that give you kind of like what they call phytodermatitis. I actually wrote a blog post on this. I haven't got the information to hand here, but if you search phytodermatitis on my blog, you'll be able to come up with some more information on that topic. So we go on to the next sense, which is hearing. Hearing is all sorts of things in the garden. It can make or break a healing garden in some ways. The kind of sounds, if you sit and close your eyes as you sit in the garden, you'll probably hear all sorts of different sounds depending on where you live. Water is the first thing that we think of in a healing garden. I've got a picture of a bird bath here, of the birds enjoying a little bath in my garden, and I personally find that quite healing, listening to them splashing around and in the bird bath and chittering on there. You also might have a pond in your garden, or you might have a fountain or a waterfall, which can be a soft sound. It can also be a hard sound. Bear that in mind if it's a bigger one. What I mean by hard sound is it can take over the sounds of the other garden. So unless you've got a big garden, I would probably go with a smaller one. And let's see, oh, the next thing we've got is wind chimes. They also can be loud or soft, depending on the size of your chime, what the chime material is made of. Some people like the sound of bamboo chimes. Some people like the sound of kind of what I like called church bells kind of sound, tinkling sound. I also have a wind chime that's kind of made of shells, so it's kind of got like a seaside kind of sound to it. So different chimes, and also I get to hear my neighbours' chimes because they have a huge big chime hanging in their tree, and I quite like the sound of that chime, but you've got to bear that in mind that sometimes you might get to hear the neighbours' noises as well. Other things we hear in the garden, wildlife. If you're creating a healing garden and you're incorporating all these features we're talking about, food and water and shelter, you'll get a wide variety of wildlife visiting your garden. My garden is actually a certified wildlife habitat with the National Wildlife Federation, which means basically I provide all these things for the animals. I provide food for them, water for them, shelter for them, and somewhere to nest. And I have noticed since I put all those different things in, the different wide variety of animals that visit my garden. I get all sorts of different birds. You can listen to the sound of the cooing doves. We also here in the southwest have the quail. That's kind of like a very haunting sound, I think. I quite like it. It's kind of a comforting sound. But you hear them calling kind of early morning, late evening. Also get lots of small critters coming in, chipmunks and squirrels. There's kind of a game going on between my dog, George, and the chipmunks. They're getting a little cheeky running across the patio, tormenting him, and of course they're always faster than he is, running in and out the plant pots. You may have frogs. I personally don't have frogs here, but I do have toads, which is a nocturnal kind of, it is a nocturnal animal. You see them mainly at night. I've seen a toad in my garden. I thought I just had the one last year. I saw him late at night when I went out. He was sitting there on the path. And then a little short while later, I saw a baby one. So apparently I had a Mr. and a Mrs. somewhere around, and I was perhaps seeing more than just the one toad I thought I was seeing. It's very difficult to spot them because they hide in the bushes and everything. And as I say, only come out at night. The other sounds in the garden we have is the sound of the wind. It can be quite comforting, and depending whether you have trees or grasses or flowers, you're going to have a rustling sound of different plants and different sounds. If you like to hear the wind in the grasses, you'll need to plant more grasses than anything else. This last point I've got, silence, and you might think, well, snow, it doesn't make a sound, but it's hard to describe that when it's snowing in the winter, there's a certain silence, a certain sound of silence of it being there in the garden, and it can be quite comforting at a time when the garden is, I like to say, it's sleeping during the winter. And that's not really something you can, plan for. It depends what climate you live in, and some people get more snow than others. We do get a little bit of snow here in Arizona, and it is kind of nice to have the odd snowfall and listen to the sound of silence, and it's healing at a time when there's no plants in the garden. Traffic and neighbours, two things we probably can't control much depending on where we live. I live in the country now, and if a car goes down the road, you kind of know about it. If you were in the city, you would have the sound of traffic a lot more outside your your door outside your garden and the neighbours as well. But I've lived in the city, and sometimes that can be a comforting sound as well. It's something you kind of get used to. So I suppose what I'm saying is it depends, you know, establish what you like and then decide where you're going to live to have this garden, and work with that. The next thing is taste, specifically culinary and medicinal herbs we're talking about here aromatically. Herbs like basil, oregano, dill, parsley, mint, rosemary. These are all tasty herbs that we're probably familiar with and put in it on our food. And, you know, it's nice to wander around the garden and just pick a leaf off something and taste it. But as I've got in the cautions there, toxins, poisonous, you've got to be aware of things. Do not taste what you don't know and you can't recognize. It may look like something you're familiar with, but if you don't know what it is, don't taste it. Some poisonous plants look very similar to plants that aren't poisonous. Don't be like my dog, put something in your mouth and then decide what it is later, or, you know, let me figure it out what it is later. Know what you're dealing with before you taste it. Then the other thing in the garden that we might taste is vegetables and fruit, and it might think of a strange thing to put in an aromatically healing garden, but vegetables and fruit are quite aromatic if you grow them yourselves. Tomatoes, for example, are very aromatic. If you rub tomato leaves and inhale the aroma of a tomato plant, it's pretty aromatic. We may not use it in aromatherapy, but in a garden, it's, you know, it's quite a nice smell. And there is such a thing as a tomato leaf oil. I got that recently from a perfumer, a tomato leaf oil, and yeah, it smells pretty much like the tomato plant. Also, you may have strawberries, raspberries, squash, depending on your climate and where you live. And all these things add to the garden, and also you might be tempted. At here is, of course, aroma, smell, something we're probably most familiar with. We've got to think about our aroma in the garden, or whether it's subtle or strong. For example, you may have herbs, and really that's not a very strong aroma unless you rub it to release the aroma and rub the leaves in your hands. For example, strong intoxicating aromas, it could be something like lilac, also roses. Unfortunately, a lot of roses have been hybridized to the point now that, you know, the aromas of the past aren't there. Roses are bred for their color and the resistance to disease, rather than the old-fashioned roses that had a lot more aroma, but they are still out there if you look for them in certain places. I have Lady Bank Rose. Its a botanical name is Rosea Banksia, I think, and it's in bloom now. I really wish I could take you outside into the garden to smell it this evening, because it is in bloom now and it's just an intoxicating aroma. It's pretty strong. You might not want to sit next to it all the time, and it's not one that we traditionally distill in aromatherapy, but it is so aromatic and so beautiful this time of year. Unfortunately, it only lasts for a few weeks and it'll be gone, but I look forward to it coming through every year. And this year in particular, it's pretty good because we had so much rain over the winter that these plants are just coming through in such profusion this spring. Also, we have to look at whether an aroma is soothing or energizing. For example, this is very similar to the oils that we use. Soothing, I think of lavender and rose, and energizing is peppermint. So if you want to sit and relax in the garden, I probably wouldn't sit next to the peppermint plant and start rubbing it. It's probably going to stimulate you a little more. whereas rose, if it's not too strong on aroma, and lavender, it's going to be a little bit more soothing. Also, personal likes and dislikes. Not a lot I can say about this, except everybody's different on this. Just note that the aroma of the plant may be different to the essential oil that you know. That last point I've got, are they the same essential oil, hydrosol, or plant extract? As we know from experience, a hydrosol, I'll just give the example of lavender here. A lavender hydrosol can smell a lot different to lavender essential oil, and depending on what species of lavender and other species of plants that you're dealing with, it's going to be different again. So, you know, find the ones you really like, and stick with that. It's so hard these days because they don't always produce the same plants in the same places every year. Again, on my blog I have aromatic seed suppliers post, and I would recommend trying to source some of those and growing some of these plants yourself. If you're not very good at growing from seed, some places do grow in the small plants, and they will ship to you if you're not local. So you may be able to establish something a little bit more authentic rather than going to the garden centre, where 9 times out of 10 they do not have botanical names, and they may not be selling you what you think is lavender. It could be spike lavender, for example. So let's see what else I have on here. Oh, I just wanted to add one final point on here. Aromas and plants will vary by region due to the climate, the elevation they're grown at, the growing conditions they're grown under, and, you know, sporadic weather patterns as well. So I may produce a plant here in Arizona in my little microclimate in my garden. It could be totally different for somebody else on the other side of Sedona in my town here. It's that different. So you've got to get something, experiment in your garden. What I do like to do is draw inspiration from my garden with the aromas for blends that I create. For example, if I'm curating a rose blend, I would go into the garden and maybe draw inspiration from the rose plants out there. When we think of rose, there's so many different layers to rose, different notes and aromas. A lot of people are told, oh, take a deep inhale, you know, of the plant or the oil. You'll get a better kind of picture and a different kind of sense if you do lots of little sniffs, and you'll start to see different aromas coming through. Oh, this one's a little bit spicy, or this one's a little bit more floral. You know, take the time to literally smell the roses. There's no better way of saying it, but there you go. So we'll spend some time looking at why aromatic plants are an integral part of a healing garden. Looking back, we've got a photo here of a monastery, and I was trying to show a cloister, the cloisters on the monastery there, because in the medieval times specifically, they grew cloister gardens, and within the monasteries they had a kitchen garden specifically for growing herbs for cooking, and then they had the medicinal garden. And so if you had an ailment or something, you'd go along and they'd prepare an ailment for you. These gardens then transpired eventually into cottage gardens where people grew their own things in their garden. Now they kind of merged the kitchen herbs with the medicinal herbs and everything in together, but they grew their own, and you know, you knew where your medicine was coming from, and it was also healing within the garden as well. And just to prove that point, there's many hospitals now that see the benefits of healing gardens to promote rest and recovery for patients. For example, people that suffer from depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder for those not familiar with that, even cancer, chronic and terminal illnesses, people find some kind of peace from just sitting in a garden and just taking the time to sit there. And as we've just talked about, you know, inhaling the aromas, seeing the different colors, taking in the sounds, and, you know, the taste of the garden. I mean, you don't really have to taste, you know, like literally put it in your garden. My dog, just to use an example, because George is very good in the garden with the aromas, he tastes, and we know this as aromatherapists, that taste is very connected to your sense of smell. He tastes things by licking, and he just literally licks. He seems like he's licking the air, but really he's, you know, he's tasting the smell as well as all the little receptors in his nose taking it in. He's taking in everything else as well. And so that's, I was just trying to demonstrate how healing that can be. The next thing, we're still looking at why aromatic plants are an integral part of a healing garden here. Many aromatic plants can be used in the same way as essential oils with regard to depression, stress, anxiety, abuse illnesses, chronic illnesses, what I just mentioned here in the previous slide. Aromas in the garden provoke similar reactions and have similar properties to our essential oils. As I just explained about the inhalation and how to do it, taking lots of little sniffs rather than big deep inhale. Sometimes it's good to do a big deep inhale, but you may overwhelm yourself with the aroma doing that. And it's a little bit more subtle. If you're just sitting there in the garden and relaxing, you may be taking in different scents from different plants as well. The next point we have is scented gardens for the visually impaired, and I want to share with you a quote from the book by Helen Keller, To Love This Life, quotations by Helen Keller. She said, "It is others who are actually blind," begin quote here, "for they have no idea how fair the flower is to the touch, nor do they appreciate its fragrance, which is the soul of the flower." And the 2 points I want to underline there is touch and fragrance that she talked about. If you think about it, visually impaired and the blind people, touch and fragrance are two important senses, because sight is not one of them. You know, it doesn't matter how colorful the flowers are. We want to touch those plants and we want to inhale them to stimulate our senses. So this is how gardens for the blind are usually created. Some use touch, whereas others use fragrance to stimulate senses. And scented flowers are a big part of that, and plants as well. I shouldn't just say flowers, some are plants as well. And leading on to that is the development of horticultural therapy. This is a recognized therapy which now has significant value for the visually impaired, is that introduce the pleasure of fragrant aromas to the visually impaired, not just for visiting, but by becoming actively involved in the growing of plants through various projects. A horticultural therapist will actually design a garden and get people involved, not just for the visually impaired. I'm just using this as an example, but anybody with any kind of illnesses. They've done studies and things now that, you know, this all helps people heal, as we're looking at here, a healing garden. So we'll go on to the next slide, which probably what most people are interested in. We've talked about the theory here. So how do we introduce healing plants into our garden? So it doesn't matter if you have a 10-acre farm, all you have is a kitchen window ledge. You can start a little healing garden. Healing garden knows no size. And probably the easiest way to do that is starting it on a sunny window ledge, a few herb pots. and just a few herb pots, maybe it's just 3 or 4 depending on how big your kitchen window ledge is. As long as it's sunny, I say kitchen window ledge because we always think of a sunny kitchen window ledge, but if your kitchen is not facing the sun, any window ledge in your house would work, as long as those plants are getting the sun and they're getting water and they're getting a little bit of love, they're going to grow. And if you have a patio, you can go on to the next stage here, larger version of the kitchen window ledge. Put your herbs outside in pots, and the good thing about having them in pots is you can take them in and out of the sun and shade, and it's particularly important where I live in Arizona because the sun can be pretty intense come the summer months, and you may want them in the sun in the early morning and late evening, but you do not want them in the sun in the middle of the day, so you can pull them in and out as applicable. And you may want to experiment with some larger plants. The photo I've got here is actually a photo of my feet and a pot of hummingbird sage, which isn't an aromatic plant per se, but it's a red plant and it's called hummingbird sage because the hummingbirds love it. It's the kind of plant that they love, which we're going to discuss here shortly. Also, you may want to grow I put small shrubs like rosemary. Rosemary can be a really small plant, but I have a rosemary bush that I put in a couple of years ago, and it was very small potted plant. It was probably in just a few inch pots. Now it's probably about 3 feet high and maybe it's a foot wide, and it's going. Rosemary grows really well here. So I guess I will have to tame it before long because it'll just keep on growing and growing. Another good place to grow plants in the garden is garden boxes. These are great putting in your own garden boxes because you can control the soil and you control the weeds. You literally put the good soil in there that the plants need to start with, and you can add and take out what you need from there, so that you usually end up with better plants than just putting them in the bare ground. That being said, landscaping, you can put plants into quite a lot of small space. I have a few odd places, and I've learned you can never have too many plants in the garden. If you find a space, put a plant in there, and it covers the landscape, and at different times of the year you'll have different plants coming through. So now I want to move on to the beneficial pollinators that we talked about. The first one we're looking at, most people are probably familiar with, are bees. Bees, sadly, are being affected in the garden and worldwide because of various things. So bees are extremely important to our aromatic garden, so you want to try and attract them as much as you can. They pollinate many aromatic plants, especially herbs, establishing a mutual beneficial relationship between insect and plant. Bees need the nectar and pollen gathered from these plants and herbs to provide both carbohydrates and protein to the bees. The plants and herbs need the bees to pollinate them in order to continue the next generation of plants and herbs. Bees love plants that are of certain colors, shapes, accessible, and that are fragrant. So we're going to have plenty of bees in your aromatic garden. So what kind of plants do bees like? They like a wide variety, but some of the examples, they do love mint, like peppermint and spearmint. They like sage, the common sage, clary sage, lavender sage, Russian sage, and even pineapple sage. They love sage, basically. I see them all over on my sage plants because sage grows pretty well here as well. Not just the common varieties, but a lot of local varieties too. They also like lemon balm or melissa. They like rosemary. They like lavender, including the true lavender, spike lavender, lavender, and they like thyme. They also like rose, barrage, geranium, calendula, sunflowers, which aren't aromatic, but I'll go on to that shortly as to why I've included them here. And cornflowers, again, not necessarily aromatic in the sense for essential oils, although cornflower, also known as bachelor's button, is used for hydrosol. They are a colourful little blue flower and very pretty to have in the garden. The next pollinator is butterflies. We've all seen them flitting around the garden, and they also are attracted to many herbs in an aromatic garden. They love toxin-free gardens, so if you have a host of butterflies in your garden, you have created a natural haven for them. Just as bees are attracted to aromatic plants for their pollen, butterflies are attracted to an aromatic plant for the nectar it supplies to them. Nectar provides high metallic butterflies with the carbohydrates they need to survive. So what kind of plants do butterflies like? They like pretty much the same as bees. So if you're planting plants for bees, you're probably attracting your butterflies. But just to mention a few different ones than I did for bees, they like dill, fennel, hyssop, lavender, we mentioned, oregano, parsley, and thyme. They also like barrage, and they also like other plants like echinacea, bee balm. This is the excuse my botanical pronunciation, the Monardera species, sunflower, calendula, and sage. So there's a few different ones for you for butterflies. Bats. You might think, oh, bats. I don't know whether I want bats in my garden. I know some people have a kind of a phobia about them, but bats like aromatic plants. They're important pollinators of certain flowers and are vital to the ecological cycle of your garden. They also control the mosquito, beetle, and moth population as part of their nightly eating habits. So, you know, be kind to those bats. You know, they may not be the most attractive of species, but they're doing a lot of good here. And they are nocturnal and will arrive in your garden as dusk falls. Consequently, you need to plant night-scented flowers or plants that continually give off an aroma if you want to attract bats to your aromatic garden. Species of bats do vary from region to region, so you may want to research the best type of aromatic plants that will grow in your area in order to attract bats. In general, bats are attracted to many traditional herbs and aromatic flowers in addition to specific night-scented flowers. I'm not that familiar with bats, but upon research I discovered that bats like the following aromatic herbs such as lavender, spearmint, sage, thyme, lemon balm, marjoram, and barrage. They also may like, and these may not necessarily be ones that we're familiar with for using essential oils, they like phlox, goldenrod, evening primrose, night-scented stock, the tobacco plant, honeysuckle, and white jasmine. They also like to hang out, literally. If you've got plants in your garden, they're going to hang out there literally. And some of the aromatic tree species that they might like include the pines. So if you have pine trees, you may have bats. They also enjoy spruce trees and non-aromatic plants such as elm and maple. Trees provide shelter and cover for bats when they are not pollinating your aromatic garden. And next up is moths. I actually just saw one of these a couple of evenings ago at dusk when I was watering my garden. This picture here is a I think it's a hummingbird moth, but they've got these long probing straw-like tongues to use to reach the nectar, and they're pretty fascinating to watch. I'd never seen one before I moved to Arizona, and at first I thought it was a hummingbird. It just literally looks like a hummingbird till you see this long probe coming out. And you see them, as I say, flitting around the garden on a late evening. And they also like also attract those higher up the food chain, including bats, birds, and other mammals. So you'll attract quite a few things. There are a lot of different species, excuse me, there are lots of different species of moths, and depending upon where you live, you'll experience different ones in your garden. A lot of moths emerge as dusk falls, but like here in Arizona, there are also daytime moths to be found in the aromatic garden. And as a point I put on there, a little food for thought, moths outnumber butterfly species by 10 to 1. Pollinating moths include the noctoid moth and the hawk moth species. They are typically attracted to strongly scented flowers. They also like pale colored flowers and plants. So what do they like? Few are the things that they might like, depending on the species of bat. So you will have to research this further. Evening primrose, flowering tobacco, plants with aromatic foliage such as marjoram, lavender, and mint, and thyme. They also like honeysuckle and jasmine. As is recommended for other aromatic plants that attract bees and butterflies, and this is an important point, the old-fashioned varieties and single-headed flowers are more attractive to moths. They contain more nectar. A lot of these hybridized plants don't contain the much-needed nectar that they need, and they also contain little fragrance. So that is a point to bear in mind. And here we come to the birds, specifically hummingbirds, amazing little creatures that we have here in Arizona. They're one of the most dominant bird species that pollinate on Anthropophylliosis flowers. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Some species of hummingbirds are co-evolved, which means that both the hummingbird and the flower species are reliant on each for continued evolution. There are various aromatic species of plants that hummingbirds favor, although it should be noted that hummingbirds are more attracted to the color of a flower rather than the scent. So they're not specifically attracted to an aromatic garden for the aroma, but they may be attracted to some of the aromatic flowers that are colorful in your garden. So for example, sage, that's a good example. They're attracted to that one, and bee balm and flowering tobacco and honeysuckle as well. They like all the ones where they can get their beaks into to extract the pollen out of it. The brightly colored flowers are designed to spread pollen on the bird's back or head when it delves into the flower for nectar. The bird then transports this pollen to mate with a compatible part of the plant on its next stop for nectar. So they, important again to the garden there. And I believe that hummingbirds are supposed to be attracted more to red colored plants and flowers. They've done various studies on this, but they haven't really concluded that this is so. All I can say is that they do love the red flowers in my garden. So we're going to go quickly through some of the profiles here. We're going to start with peppermint here, and this is probably one of the most familiar mints of the garden. I have put plant zones on here. I am not going to pronounce all the botanical names. You've got them on the slides here, and I don't want to mispronounce any of these names here, but you can see what they are to reference them for your future research. Peppermint is plant zones 3 to 9. I kind of use this as, a guideline because I have grown plants here in my garden that supposedly won't grow in my plant zone, which is zone 8 here. So use it as a guideline. If some slides are going to come up, you're not going to see plant zones on. That's because they're annual plants, so they grow once and die. I've only put it on for the perennial plants. How to identify peppermint? It has aromatic dark green leaves, and it has a very strong minty aroma. It's a hardy and strong plant, and it will take over if you let it. You can grow it in pots, boxes, or as garden cover, but be warned, if you grow it as garden cover, it's going to take over everything else around it. I personally grow it in pots, like to try and contain it. You know, if you've got it in a pot, it can only go so far. If you plant it in a box, it's going to take over that box as well. So just be careful where you plant it. The next one is spearmint. It grows in plant zones 3 to 11, so pretty similar to peppermint. And of course, it's botanically related. It's in the same plant family there. It's also in the same genus. The difference between peppermint and spearmint is that spearmint has aromatic pale green leaves, and you can see that between the two plants that I have. They look very similar. The leaves are shaped pretty similar, but probably what you need to remember the most is that peppermint has the dark green leaves and spearmint has the pale green leaves, and the minty aroma is not as dominant. It's described as similar to chewing gum, and that basically is what it is. It's the same as peppermint. It's going to take over if you don't contain it. So grow it in a pot if you don't want it to take over the rest of your garden. Basil, or basil as we would call it in England, the American pronunciation is basil, so there's a bit of information for you if you didn't know that. Also botanically related to the mints. Very similar looking in the leaf there, as you can see, aromatic, green, ovate, like oval leaf, but it's got shiny leaves, whereas peppermint and spearmint don't have shine. They don't have a shine to it. If you want to describe it in photography terms, it's kind of matte. The peppermint and spearmint kind of matte compared it to shiny. That's kind of the best way I can describe it. It's got a spicy herbaceous aroma, and that will vary depending on cultivar and the genus as well. It's a tender annual, and I speak from experience, it does not like cold or even a little bit of frost. It's going to die. So if you don't take it in the winter, I can get it to grow through if I protect it and bring it outside in the warmer months. But it still doesn't all grow as well, but the slightest bit of cold or frost, it's going to die. It'll grow in summer gardens, pots and plant boxes, so it depends on what type of garden you have. Going to go through oregano, or oregano, yes. It grows in plant zones 5 to 10. It has aromatic dark green ovate leaves similar to basil, but not as shiny. Again, it's kind of got flatter leaves than basil has. A lot of these are very similar, so this is why you're going through them, and this is why I say to you, if you don't know what it is, don't put it in your mouth. It has a spicy herbaceous aroma, also with a camphorous aroma as well. This plant is a hardy perennial, and again, I speak from experience. My oregano is coming through with a vengeance already this spring, starting to take over its corner of the garden. It died right back in the winter, but it's coming through again. So it pretty much looks after itself with a bit of love and water and sunshine. Next up is Barrage. Now this is the plant I talked about earlier. The reason I've included it's got a beautiful blue star-shaped flowers, which actually start out as pink and then they turn to blue on maturity. And it's a hairy plant with grey-green leaves. It's supposed to be an annual or biennial. It's come back in my garden, and it's such a pretty plant. It's not necessarily aromatic. It's used as a carrier oil, and in herbalism it's used in salads and things, but it doesn't have any aroma. But I've included it because A, we do use it in aromatherapy, and B, it's such a beautiful plant to look at. I would grow it in a raised bed or a herb garden. It's probably too big for a pot. Maybe it's a larger pot you could grow it in. Again, I would watch out for possible phytodermatitis with this one. Sunflower. I just love this plant, this flower. It's the happy flower of the garden. Some flowers always turn their heads towards the sun. Last year I had one that was taller than me, but I do believe, especially on sunflower farms, they can grow up to 15 feet in height. It is an annual. As I say, it can seed itself, so you may see it popping up all over the place if the birds don't get to the seed first. Again, sunflowers have no aroma, but they used to produce a carrier oil and color therapy in and the next year she had a whole abundance of them. The birds carry the seeds and tend to plant them. So maybe one day, you know, you might lucky. I've had a sunflower too pop up in the garden where I did not plant them. So it's always nice to see this happy flower pop up in the garden. Rosemary. It grows in plant zones 5 to 9. As I mentioned, it can grow quite big, start off as a small herb and then grow up quite big. It's got beautiful blue flowers. You rub the leaves, which are kind of like needle-like leaves. You know, it's very aromatic plant. It's hard to grow from seed, although I successfully did propagate one last year, and it's now just a few inches high, but I'm confident it is going to grow into a big bush this time, you know, in a few years' time. It has a camphorous aroma with a spicy mint undertone. Again, you know, take a bit of time to inhale it and see what you can get out of it. I would check local garden groups for local varieties because it does vary. Rosemary is a prolific grower here in Arizona if it's cared for properly, but it depends on your area. It may not grow as well. I've included German chamomile here. This is a small herb with feather-like leaves and daisy-like flowers. Again, it's an annual. It has a herbaceous apple-like aroma, and it's pretty much can grow in pots or grow them on your window ledge or in your herb garden. Sage, pretty much what I've got there, plant zones 5 to 9. Do check your varieties. This is the official common sage, but there's lots of other varieties. I've got silver ovate leaves there. It should really read silver green ovate leaves. I only just picked that up as I was going through my notes tonight, so it should say silver green ovate leaves. It's got spicy herbish aroma. So many varieties and cultivars. Like I say, check your local garden center or supplier for those different varieties. So I just got a few recipes here from the garden. If you're enjoying the plants in your garden, you also want to enjoy something from your garden. So this is just a recipe for aromatic tea, well, chamomile tea specifically, although you can probably do this with most herbs as long as you know what you're doing with them. Directions pretty much speak for themselves there. I've got use a strainer on top of a cup and pour, or you can use a tea ball, and what I've seen recently is you can have the teapots with the built-in infusions. These are kind of the modern way of doing the old thing where we just used to use a strainer and pour it through. Now you can actually get a teapot to do the job for you. If you don't like the bitter taste of herbs, add a bit of honey in that to sweeten. And chamomile specifically can be used for stress, anxiety, and insomnia. We've got mint infused oil here. This is a good one to you know, use in aromatherapy for body care products. I do recommend drying the plant material before you add it to your mason jar. Otherwise, the fresh can hold water, and you may end up with mold or bacteria forming on that. So just a good point to remember there. And I've also got strained plant material to leave oil. You can add in more material and re-infuse as required. This is an interesting recipe. You're wondering what we're going to do with the Barrage flower. Well, here we go. You can add a Barrage flower for visual impact in your drinks for the summer. Just simply freeze them and then add them to your summer drink. You can also add in a sprig of mint there as well, depending on your drink. I was just talking about this earlier. You could put peppermint in there. You could add a sprig of spearmint. You can also get the chocolate mints and apple mints. There's all sorts of mints you can get now. So depending on what you prefer, you can add that in as well. Just going to quickly go through the slides here. This is a bee on an anemone. It's got no aromatic use in the garden to my knowledge. It's used for ritual, and they are pretty flowers. This is around Unculus. I hope I pronounced that right. Again, no aromatic use, just visual. I wanted to include this photo because you can actually see the sepals. Here on the outside, there's sepals, and inside the petals. This is bee balm, also known as bergamot, or bergamot. It's not to be confused with the fruit of the same name. This is the Monastery species that I was talking about earlier. And it's mainly used in herbalism for salads, teas, tinctures, headaches, sore throats. Leaves can be used for insect bites and bronchial congestion. This is just a general view of my garden last summer. You can see some tomato plants at the front there, some impatiens here, petunias, all visual. This being the tomato plant, aromatic. And this is a beautiful blue cornflower, which is an annual. It's actually considered a weed in European cornfields, hence its name, but it's a beautiful little flower. And it's used in aromatherapy and a hydrosol for tired eyes. Here's the sunflower, and here in the middle, this is actually composed of tiny flower heads within the flower head of itself, which is typical of this plant family. And this I wanted to include because this is an anomaly of nature. This is actually a triple-headed sunflower that grew in my garden last year. And I don't know how it did it, but that's 3 heads on one plant. This is some more flowers in my garden. These are actually asters and zinnias in late summer. Again, not aromatic, but very pretty to look at. And this is a beautiful echinacea. It's used mainly in herbalism medicinally, but can be infused as an oil for inflammation, analgesic, boost the immune system, allergies, and slow healing wounds. And another view of echinacea. I just can't stop photographing this flower. It's just such a pretty flower to photograph. This is just a close-up of a flower. It shows the filament of the flower here, and yeah, that's right, the filament and the anther here on the end. I just wanted to show the whole thing there. And that whole thing is called the stamen, which is where the pollen is produced. And this is a Rosa rugosa. It's actually an old-fashioned rose. It's not double-headed, which retain the fragrance. This is a part of hummingbird sage, an example of red flower which attracts hummingbirds, with the long tubular flower that allows them to get their beak into and hover without getting pollen on their wings. And this final slide shows my dog George enjoying the garden. In the background is a pot of herbs that include mint, oregano, basil and thyme in here. And this is George enjoying the garden, and he's concluding a presentation for the night. So I'll hand it back to Kelly now.
Wow, I loved your presentation so much, Sharon. I
Thank you.
loved it. You're just one of my favorite people, but also, and then listening to your beautiful accent on top, but all your beautiful pictures, just inspiring. I'm getting ready to do my garden, and I think you inspired me to try Barrage, so I think we're going to try that.
Oh, good.
I hope other people will too. So thank you very much.
I'm happy to hear that. You're welcome. Thank you.